Okay, we're going to get started now. First of all, welcome. My name is Adriana Jacobs. I'm Associate Professor of Modern Hebrew Literature at the University of Oxford. And this year I'm co-head fellow with Maya Barzilai of the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies, which is focused this year on the theme of translating Jewish cultures. And as part of the Institute, Alex Moshkin, who's also a fellow with us this year, and I have curated the series that has occasioned this event today. The series Stranger Still, Translating Contemporary Poetry from Israel, Palestine, showcases the diversity of poetic voices from Israel, Palestine through the lens of translation. Each event will feature a multilingual poetry reading and a conversation between poets and translators on the careful negotiations that are involved in the act of translation, highlighting work that creates its own currents against and beyond the Israeli mainstream. Today's event will feature the poet Rita Kogan, whom Alex will introduce in a moment, and future events will include the poets and translators Van Wyn, Sabine Hyun, Yosef Haraz, Sheikha Khilavi, Karen Alkalai Gut, and more. So stay tuned for more event details. And before I pass things on to Alex, I want to take a moment to thank the Frankel Center and its tireless staff for making this event possible.
Thank you, Adriana. So with the poetry we selected, we hope to illuminate the inherent diversity, but also the fraught complexity of Israeli culture and society. Many of the poets and translators that will be joining us assume a minoritarian position towards Hebrew language and poetry, either because of their history of migration and displacement, or because Hebrew is just one of their linguistic and cultural homes, or because their aesthetic is just too transgressive, disjointed, idiosyncratic, and simply different. This is why I was so pleased with the title of the series, Stranger Still, that Adriana, you picked. Please feel free to submit your question via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, and we will read those during the Q&A section. And now, let me welcome Rita Kogan and Zackary Sholem Berger to our virtual stage for our conversation. So Rita Kogan is a poet and translator producing original poetry in Hebrew and translations from her native Russian. Born in Leningrad in 1976 and immigrating to Israel in 1990, Kogan's poetry explores the challenges that Russian-speaking women encounter in their daily life in Israel, including ethnic discrimination, sexual violence, and the difficulty of expressing sexuality in a patriarchal society. In her poems, we also encounter a poet who revels in love, literature, and sailing. She is the author of Rishayon L'Shgiot Ktiv, License to Misspell, 2015, and Sus Bachatzait, Horse in a Skirt, 2018, a runner-up to the prestigious Gardner-Simon Prize for Hebrew Poetry. She's also a translator of works of Anna Akhmatova, Marina Tsvetaeva, Osip Mandelstam, Joseph Brodsky, Alexander Pushkin, and others. Zackary Sholem Berger lives multiple literary lives. He's a poet and translator working in as well as between Yiddish, Hebrew, and English. His work has appeared in multiple venues, including Poetry Magazine, the Yiddish Forward, and Asymptote. Themes of his verse range from philosophical and medical to the immediate problems of his adopted city, Baltimore. In the Yiddish world, he might be best known as a regular contributor to the Vorwärts and the translator of Dr. Seuss's Cat in the Hat, as well as other Seuss creations, into Yiddish. His translations of prose poetry of Avrom Sutzkever are due to appear in book form next month. So shall we just proceed with the poetry reading section of the event and then gather up for a conversation? One second. Good. Take it from here.
Okay, so I'll read the first in Hebrew and then probably English. Okay. אז שיר הגירה, הגדרה עצמית. את נראית לא מפה, את נראית לא משם. למה קר לך? את רוסיה. למה חם לך? את מישראל. יאו, אין לך מבטא. דווקא יש לך מבטא. את יהודיה? משני הצדדים? כמה זמן את בארץ? 20 שנה בארץ ועוד לא התרגלת? מאיפה הגעת? אני מתכוון משם. אני מתכוון מפה. שמאלנית, מוזר. את רוסיה. יש חבר? אין? מוזר. את רוסיה. לא תזדייני איתי? לא מתאים. את רוסיה. הזדיינת איתו? כבר? נו בטח. את רוסיה. And now in English, the immigration poetry, the self-definition. You don't look like you're from here. You don't look like you're from there. Why you're cold? Aren't you Russian? Why are you hot? Aren't you Israeli? Wow, you don't have an accent. Actually, you do have an accent. Are you Jewish? On both sides? How long have you been in Israel? 20 years and you still haven't got used to it? Where are you from? I mean from here. I mean from there. You're leftist? Weird. You're Russian. Do you have a boyfriend? No? Weird. You're Russian. You want to fuck me? No? But you're Russian. You fucked him already? Sure. You're Russian. Okay.
And Frida, I think Zach will read the English.
The English? Okay.
Just so you can save your voice for the conversation.
Okay. Okay. Matryoshka. Matryoshka is this Russian doll that goes one inside another. Like I believe that people know it. Okay. איזה לב יש לים, ואיזה לב יש למאפליה. ומה עושה קוקייה במשך 59 דקות בתוך בית ללא חלונות? ואיך מרגישה מטריושקה? קטנה ביותר, אחרונה, על כי אין בתוכה דבר.
Matryoshka. What kind of heart has the sea? And what kind of heart has the darkness? And the cuckoo, what does it do for 59 minutes inside a house with no windows? And Matryoshka, the last one, the smallest, how does she feel about having nothing inside?
שירת הים. סבתא רבתא שלי לא נהגה ברכב ולא השיטה מפרשית. סבתא רבתא לא יצתה את ביתה לפרנסו. היא ילדה ילדים, שרדה מלחמות. סבתא שלי לא נהגה ברכב ולא השיטה מפרשית. סבתא שלי הגישה ופינתה צלחות עבור בעלה. היא הייתה רופאה, נלחמה על סטלינגרד. אמא שלי נוהגת ברכב בחשש מה ושטה איתי במפרשית בקיץ אחת לשנתיים. אמא שלי התחתנה כי צריך פעמיים. היא יודעת ליצור עולמות ממילים. החיבוק שלה מרפא. אני נוהגת ברכב, מהנדסת בחירה. יודעת קוד, גברים ושירה. לא התחתנתי. ספק אם אלד ילדים. אני משיטה מפרשית.
Song of the Sea. My great-grandmother didn't drive a car and didn't sail a boat. My great-grandmother never worked outside the home. She gave birth to children and survived wars. My grandmother didn't drive a car and didn't sail a boat. My grandmother cooked and cleaned after her husband. She was a doctor and fought at Stalingrad. My mother drives a car, a bit uncertainly, and goes sailing with me in summer, once every 2 years. My mother got married because she needed to, twice. She can make worlds from words and heal with an embrace. I drive a car and am chief engineer. I know coding, men, and poetry. I never married. Doubt if I'll have a kid. I sail a boat.
Okay, that's a tough one, but got it. אמא, אני לא רוצה להתרבות. אמא, אני לא רוצה להתרבות. אף פעם לא רציתי. במקום זה רציתי לחצות את האוקיינוס האטלנטי ולהפליג בקו המשווה, וכאשר יהיה לי יותר זמן פנוי וקצת יותר כסף, אפליג. שם וגם שם. בינתיים אני מפליגה בים התיכון וקצת בים האדריאטי ומתאמנת על קשרי הצלה. אמא, אני לא רוצה להתרבות. אף פעם לא רציתי. במקום זה רציתי לקרוא עוד ועוד ועוד ספרים, ולכתוב קצת ספרים, ולתרגם קצת ספרים, ולצייר ולפסל ולראות המון 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 אמנות. אני חיה כמו פפי גרב ארוכה, בבית משלי עם חיות, בלי חוקים של המבוגרים. אמנם זה לא וילה, אלא דירונת סחורה, ובמקום סוס וקופיף יש לי 4 חתולים ועץ אהבה, ואבי לא ימצא על אי בלב ים, ואין לי ארגזים עם מטבעות זהב במרתף, ואני לא ילדה הכי חזקה בעולם, אך שערי עודנו ג'ינג'י, ואני חובשת כובע קש יפני בקיץ, ואני חזקה בעולם.
Sorry.
Mom, I don't want to reproduce. Mom, I don't want to reproduce. I've never liked the notion. Instead, I'd like to cross the Atlantic Ocean and sail along the equator. With more free time and a bit more money, I'll sail to them both. In the meantime, I sail on the Mediterranean, sometimes on the Adriatic, practicing bowline knots. Mom, I don't want to reproduce. I've never liked the notion. Instead, I want to read more and more and more books, write a few, translate some others, draw and sculpt, and look at so much art. I live like Pippi Longstocking in my home, with my animals, without grown-ups. It's not a big house, just a rented studio. Instead of a horse and a monkey, I have 4 cats and a love tree. And my father won't be found on an island in the middle of the sea. I don't have chests full of gold in the basement, and I'm not the strongest girl in the world, but I support myself. My hair is orange. I wear a Japanese hat in summer, and I'm firmly in this world.
Great. So I think we can start the conversation. Thank you for this beautiful reading.
Thank you.
And I'll start asking Rita if I might. And this is an oft asked question, I think, but it's worthwhile to ask it. Rita, does being a poet translator like you are affect the own verse, the verse one writes oneself?
It affects mostly when I read some poetry of certain author for a long time enough, and when I translate just one poem, it's very small effect, but while I do it for a long time, and it takes a long time, like it took me sometimes with Pasternak, when I translated about 5-6 songs from Dr. Zhivago, it really affects me, but it should be like a certain period of time that I'm doing it, and then it's go under your skin and inside your brain, and it just it doesn't leave you, and yes, it really affects. And to say, but I think it's always like a function of how long I'm doing it in a certain period of time.
And I know two literary traditions that you've been immersed in for quite a bit have been the Hebrew and the Russian traditions. And can you discuss for a bit how your work as a translator brings them closer together, or whether in fact that is part of your goal as a translator?
I learned that the Hebrew literature and Hebrew poetry was affected deeply by the Russian literature and the Russian poetry in the beginning of the 20th century. I learned it rather late because nobody talked about it back then in 90s when it came to Israel. But when I learned it, it was just big shock for me that Leah Goldberg and Rachel, they both wrote in Russian before they wrote in Hebrew, and they translated Russian poetry, and they translated both Anna Akhmatova, and it just gave me some kind of attachment because of my attachment to Russian poetry of the beginning of the previous century. It really got me closer to them, and I think this is how I started dive into Hebrew poetry, because it took me some time. And later on, I discovered other poets like Natan Alterman and Avot Sharon, although they were really different kind of probably a kind of poetry. And after that, of course, Amichai, that is very well known and well read. But it's always, I always try to back then, I think even in Alterman, I always see this Russian poetry, and also in Shlonsky. And yes, it's made me feel, in the past, it made me feel like I'm back home in some kind of meaning, because otherwise it's very difficult to find the start. And after that, you can go and discover other poets like Zach, that was actually more influenced by English poetry. Okay, so it was a bit different for me. And of course, one of my favorite poets that live nowadays, and Dori Monor, which came from which is very influenced by the French poetry, which is also like very much. So it's always like connected, but it always goes through some other continent. Sometimes it's Russia, sometimes it's Europe. So it's all mixed up probably, and I feel it in translations and in my own writing.
Sorry, I was muted. What you just discussed, Rita, made me think about the fact that there is something remarkably similar about migration and translation. Both are inherently about movement between languages, geographical borders, and different cultures. How did your immigration to Israel influence your literary and translation practices?
It forced me to do something that I actually never imagined that I will translate from Russian to another language, because it was natural for me to translate to Russian. So I've studied English, started to learn English when I was about 6 years old. And when I was about 8 or 9, I translated my first poem from English. It was by Alfred Tennyson. And some Scottish ballads, which I was very fond of. And when I came to Israel, so it was a really huge shock for me. And about I think 3 years after the immigration, it was my first trial to translate something. It was horrible, and I didn't really had much books back then. And some of the poetry I translated by heart, like poems that I learned by heart, so I could translate them. And what is funny, my Hebrew was really poor back then, and I was not really sure which word it means what. And sometimes I missed the exact meaning, so the translation sometimes it's kind of funny if I read them now. But this is what started it, the translation. So in the translation, I felt more confident than in my own writing. And after translate of years of translation, mostly for myself, I started to write something by myself, and yeah, it was really influenced back then. And after years of doing it, I tried to find my own tune, my own voice. But probably without immigration, I never imagined it actually will do it.
Yeah, immigration just forces you to live in two languages and two cultures, and a lot of the time you end up being a bridge between those languages and cultures just in your life. So my second question relates to the fact that just the specificity of the Russian Jewish community in Israel. So more or less in comparison to virtually all other spaces of diasporic Russian literature in Europe and North America, post-Soviet writers in Israel have been the slowest to abandon their native Russian tongue. For some, this related to their perception of Hebrew language and culture as unsophisticated and provincial, in contrast to the Veliki and Maguchi Russian language, typically regarded as the language of world literature. For other people, the incentive was financial, since the Russian book market is just so much larger than the Hebrew one. And for still others, especially those who immigrated to Israel at an advanced age, the switch to Hebrew was simply too difficult. But in the last decade, younger Russian Israeli writers and artists like yourself have come to embrace Hebrew as their language of choice in cultural life and literary expression. Was your decision to write in Hebrew deliberate, or it just was a fact of life? Was it a decision? And what attitude towards Hebrew does your poetry assume? Do you write differently from canonical Hebrew poets? Do you experiment with bilingualism, hybridization, diasporization of language, or any other devices like these?
Okay, so first of all, I'm in love with Hebrew. I think it's kind of an adoration. This is why I really identify myself like with poets and writers like David Fogel, that he was not Israeli, but he was a Hebrew. Like sometimes it's I adore this language. I don't really know how to explain it, but it happens. Just, you know, sometimes you fall in love with people, with things, with languages, and you don't even know why it happened to you, but it happened to me. And I think the most why it happened when we came here. I was always a bookworm. I can't live without books. I'm like book junkie. I can't live without reading. It was like meaningless existence for me. And when we came here, we came with really few books, and some of them were sent by mail, and it took long months to receive them here. So, and there were no Russian stores with books here, and where we lived, it was also very hard to get English literature. But the Hebrew literature, it was just there. So I knew that if I want to read, I need to be able to read Hebrew. This is how simple as that. And I remember that in school, at high school, I read a short story by Agnon, which is one of my favorite writers. It was Tehillah. And also B'dmi Mea, it's I don't know how to say B'dmi Mea, in her early age, or in your youth. Two very genius short stories, and I read it with a dictionary. it was also not really possible because the dictionary was not very big. And then it probably happened then. Probably Agnon made me fall in love, and also Steinberg. The short stories, I don't know why, short stories. Maybe today we would have discussion about short stories. Maybe short stories are good for the immigrants. They're short. You can read it with dictionaries and still comprehend the entire thing. And later on, I still feel it, that I don't have I can't read it. I can't write in Russian. I can write, of course I can write in Russian physically. I know Russian, like it's my mother tongue, but I live inside Hebrew. I breathe Hebrew. I live inside Hebrew. It's all around me, and I want to write Hebrew. This is the voice over that is which is narrating my everyday life. So it's Hebrew. I'm not asking myself where we'll sell it, because I actually never been thinking about selling literature. Okay.
Well, poetry doesn't pay that well. We all know.
I'd say no, no, never.
Too. Still me. I actually have a question for you, Zach. You translate and write in Yiddish. Could you talk a little about how that work influenced your approach in translating Hebrew or Russian Israeli poetry, if it does, given the long literary contact between Yiddish and those other languages?
Yes, it's a great question, and I need to. I fell in love with Yiddish, but I also love Hebrew, and harking back to the two languages model, and I love them both. And I think there are similar questions in translating to and from these languages. Of course, they've had different fates, especially after the war and after the Holocaust. Hebrew is in a much different space as far as prestige and relative safety compared to Yiddish, but they both have a lot to do. Translating and writing in these languages bring about the same questions, grosso modo, about the interaction between particularism and universalism, who one is writing for, who one is translating for. Even though Hebrew is the language of a national culture, it is not uncommon these days for writers like Rita and her colleagues to look towards the history of diasporic Hebrew. And especially if you're writing or translating in Yiddish, the question is always, especially in a capitalist society like many of us live in, the question is, why could this possibly matter because you're not going to make any money? Why could this possibly matter because the audience is limited? Which I think applies to Hebrew as well in a significantly different way, but in a similar way. And that's one way in which there's a similarity. And the second is how to render the particularism of Hebrew in translation comes about all the time in Yiddish, right? So as a Hebrew writer, Rita and other writers, of course, lean upon idioms in Hebrew, which have been assimilated from the Tanakh and other traditions, and how to translate those in an accessible yet faithful way is something that one comes across in the Yiddish all the time. So, obviously there are no solutions that I've reached, but the commonality is very helpful. And before I end answering, I have to say the image of an 8-year-old Rita Kogan translating Tennyson, like that's worth a poem in itself. That's something I'll think about. And so Rita, I'll take this segue to ask you a couple of sort of related questions about this contemporary Hebrew poetry. I guess 2 questions in one, and maybe they're linked. One is, who do you think are the Hebrew poets, the contemporary Hebrew poets that might be least known in translation or in the outside world in general that you think we should know about? And secondly, I wonder whether you could voice an opinion about the context in Israel or in the broader literary community in Israel, Palestine, and outside between Hebrew and Arabic and Russian language poets, and whether there's a contact that helps create a shared literary community, and to what extent that's true, or you think that's true?
First about the poets. So one of the communities, one of the literature communities that I'm really happy to participate in is Ho. It's like literature magazine which is published twice a year, and it's the chief editors are Dorian Manor, one of the two of them, and Sivan Baskin. So both of them, I really love their poetry. I know that they're translated. I don't think that they're translated enough. I really like also Tehel Frosh poetry. I know she's translated, and she always also will be on the right, Tehel Frosh. I think that Adriana translated her, probably, maybe. So I really liked her. I really like her poetry as well. I think that nowadays it's something interesting happens in Israel, in Hebrew poetry, in Israeli poetry, with the classical form is revived, and it's revived differently. So it's an interesting, it's really an interesting thing to check it out. The second part of the question, is there a common community? Once Terry Pratchett, the British writer, he said that it's not possible to make a community of witches because everyone is very opinionated. So a community of poets, it's kind of a community of witches by Terry Pratchett, and I think it will be very hard to make some kind of working community in one language, and it will be even harder to make this community in multiple languages, and also in kind of a, not simple geopolitical situation. So I have a friend. She is a poet. She's Russian. She's writing in Russian. Yulia Viner. Probably she's a genius. I really love her poetry. She's an elder woman, and she's a genius. And once she translated one of my poems into Russian, and then she told me, dear, it's better that you put a translation on your Facebook page, but because they don't really like you on the Russian street in Israel because you're too leftist, and that is it. It just explains it all. It's too complicated. It's a very small world of poetry with a lot of different passions, and everybody is pretty sure that her passion is the best one. So communities will be a bit hard to assemble it together, probably.
Rita, just to give a counterweight to your stance here, I think that's precisely the translation and bilingualism, or those tools that can bring those community together. And a lot of the Russian-speaking writers are translating a lot of Hebrew language works, poetry, prose. Gali Dana-Zinger does that for many, many years. She runs a bilingual literary journal called Dvaitoche or Nikudatayim.
Yeah, sure.
Which is
but it's still not a community.
It's not a community. It's an imaginary community.
It's an imaginary community, yeah. But yes, of course, the translation. Yes, the translation is the main tool that we can create this kind of a dialogue. And actually, I read Mahmoud Darwish's poem also in Russian translations, not only in Hebrew translations. So and I really love his poetry. It goes all the way. So I would like to read any poetry in any language I can read.
Yeah, though the Russophone writers in Israel actually don't know anyone who is translating from Arabic. Maybe there are some, but I don't know them.
Maybe, but I don't want to say, but I'm not. I don't know, but it's maybe because it's also that's always a new immigration that comes to Israel. It's all nowadays as well, and they're totally different. They're totally different perception of the geopolitical situation. It's very I really like it because they see things different, and it's amazing.
Definitely, they're called the Putin's Aliyah. I like that name. So one time after my co-translation of your poem Song of the Sea, Rita, you told me that you like the translation, but you don't recognize the poem anymore at all. How do you see your poems once they cross over to other languages, like English or others?
Sometimes I feel like they are just better. And it's always like, okay, that's me. I don't know. But I think it's probably something common. I think it's a good thing because the language is also it's just not just the words, it's also the connections and the images that we create in our minds when we read certain words, and probably the images, they're different, and it's a good thing because they're not totally different, they're slightly different, and I really like it. I like it, and I always feel it not only with my poems, but poems that I really like. I read them in translation, and they're different, and I think it's this is probably how it should be. Yeah, I don't know.
I think we have time for one or two more questions, and then we'll move to the Q&A section. So if anyone has some questions, please send them over to us. But I wanted to ask you about the influence of the Hebrew literary group Ars Poetica on your poetry. I know from you that you visited their events, and I was wondering if you could speak about it because I'm interested.
Yeah, so it was very inspiring experience for me. I live in Tel Aviv, and Tel Aviv is before this whole epidemic thing started, it was a very lovely city with a lot of poetry events, and I tried to go to poetry events back then. It was a terrible experience. I felt very awkward there, and then this whole Ars Poetic thing started, and it always took place at noontime, usually at Fridays, and there was music and alcohol, and it was very light atmosphere, very welcoming atmosphere. So I came there by myself, and I listened to the poetry, and I really like it. And what I loved about it, that they wrote poems about social problems, and this is not something that in classical poetry, which it's my strong background, it's not an appropriate thing to write about. You can write about the poetry, but like some in Bohemian style, like some Puccini style, the La Bohème, but not like about your grandma in some in some little town in the periphery of the Israel. So it's not poetical, but suddenly it is, and you have you can write about it and you can speak about it. So it was very strong experience, and so I understood back then that I also can write about it and not conceal it, because you try to conceal this stuff. I try not to talk about it because it's something that you want on one hand to forget, and another thing, you're still ashamed about things and you don't know really how to bring it into your writing. So it was great experience. And also Adiki Sar, she was the poet behind the whole thing, and she was really promoting women. And it was also very important because in other channels, the promotion was sometimes kind of problematic. And with her, it was just very straight. I sent poems, she read it, she told me, okay, I like this one, I would like this one. And she just invited me once, and it was really great for me because I didn't know how to make this step, and this awkward feeling, it disappeared. I felt really welcome there, and so after being there, I could go back to my classical forms, and it was enriched. It was not. You can write about everything in any style you choose. So it was really really good experience, I think, for me.
Yes, I think the influence of Ars Poetica on Russian language, Russian Israeli poets is so important, because usually when we think about those two communities, Russians in Israel and Mizrahi Jews in Israel, then you hear about the conflict, about the struggle, about two communities that are antagonistic from one another. And there's so much similarity in the history of relocation to Israel, that that's why it seems to me the social protest poetry can so easily move from the Ars Poetica poets to Hebrew-speaking Russian Israelis ones, just because of that similarity and homology.
Yeah, actually, I really agree with you, because I always said it, and maybe I will sound some kind of a communist, but it's not about the where we came, but our social economical position. And my boyfriend, he is Mizrahi, his family is Mizrahi Jews, and one of his favorite poets back there in 90s, it's Boris Rigi, because when he heard his poetry translated into English, it killed him, you know. It was about me. It was about our neighborhoods, and you see, this is what important, I think. This question that we ask ourselves about our existence and our position, and this is how poetry connects things. And you know how a kid from Beersheba is seeing this documentary about Boris Rigi, and he feels, okay, this is my soul brother. This is how it should be, I think.
I guess I have one more question, if I could, for Rita, and that is, you mentioned Ho, the journal, and I think it's been obviously important for a lot of people. And I wonder if you could just say a bit more about how that journal has affected your writing and translation, and what do you think it means to the Hebrew literary world more generally?
The Ho magazine, there was one of the magazine, it was one of them, I think about 2 years ago. It was all about Arabic poetry and Yiddish poetry. And it was a bestseller ever. It was like people really loved it. And this is a good thing. This is probably this community we were talking previously, which can be done, but you know, people should be working at it, and we should have this suggestions and write. Okay, you want to write, they need to reach others to write and to translate. And it was really it was really wonderful Ho back then. Ho was my dream for a long time, and I'm very, very happy that I can publish there. people read poetry, and they read whole, and they buy poetry, and they are interested, and you can find their really young and inspiring artists. That was their first this is their first poetry they ever got published, and it could be very classical form and very postmodern form, and I think it's really an event in Hebrew literature, and also it exists for, like, I think for, I don't know, I don't want to tell, I think more than 10 years, I think so. So it's a tradition, and the literature tradition, this is what we don't have still, because the language, the modern Hebrew, it's still very young as a language. And this literature tradition that goes on and on year after year, it's very, very important, because you cannot create inside the vacuum. You need this surrounding, you need this and other people to talk about it. And I think this is the community probably we are looking for. And I think it's a very, very, very important to have it, and I'm really happy that I can be part of it. And for example, I translate Pasternak. I asked myself, who will be interested in this song, these poems from Dr. Zhivago? Who will read it? And suddenly, yes, people wanted people, and they asked me, please translate more. And we worked on with Sivan on editing it. We were really thinking about every word, and it was a great experience. Something from your past life, suddenly it's still important, and it's there is no value for this thing.
Okay, so I think it's time to open up the floor for questions, and the first one is coming from Sasha Senderovich. Thank you all for this conversation. I guess I have a question about ... English. I'm struck by this conversation in which you, the poet and translators, have to navigate the poetry of native Russian speaker who writes in Hebrew in yet a third language. How does Rita relate to English as a language in which she doesn't write and which is not her native, but which is somehow required to speak to an audience outside of Israel? And to the translators, how does it work to translate it in English, the poetry that is Hebrew but has Russian echoes? So who would like to tackle this question first?
Well, maybe my answer might be the shortest, is that, I mean, it's not an easy question, but maybe I have maybe the least complicated, because as a native English speaker and someone that writes poetry in English, the most productive, I mean, there's a lot of translation theory out there, and many people listening to this talk have a greater knowledge of translation theory than I do. But as a translator, I want to create a poem when I'm done. It's a poem that is both like and unlike the original, right? And wants to faithfully represent the original, but I'm writing it in English, or I'm writing it with Alex or whichever collaborator in English. So that comes naturally to me. And I think, and since I'm in a predominantly English-speaking environment, I can think of who my public is. So for me, it doesn't make it harder. It doesn't make it, and perhaps there's a danger of seeing English and being an English hegemony and the international model of English. There's a danger of flattening out the original to appeal to that audience. So that's probably a danger to be avoided.
English is an international language, I think, still. I started to learn English from really young age, and I loved it. I loved English. I still love it. Probably I should, and in my work, in my everyday work, we write in English. Everything is going on in English, even we write to each other. It's never Hebrew. And now when I learn French and I need to translate something, I translate it into English, not into Russian, not into Hebrew. I don't even know why. And sometimes I do read in English. I do not do it. Original poetry I read in English. I read Ian McEwan in English and really loved it. I should do it more, but I need to understand which is more important to me. So if I could read more English literature in English, it will be like a great experience. I now renewed my subscription to New Yorker, so probably I'll do it again. I know one thing, that if we were going to United States instead of Israel back then in the 90s, I would be writing in English probably.
I'll be brief just because there are so many interesting questions that were submitted. But for me, first of all, translating Rita started. It's a project of love, but it's also a project that I needed because I wanted to talk about this poetry in my dissertation. What language to write in? I mean, having lived in Israel, Russia, Canada, Kazakhstan, America, Kyrgyzstan to date, and more, I feel like I speak all those languages imperfectly and with an accent, but so I feel like I have permission to translate it to any language that needed. But more seriously, I needed that for academic work in a North American university. So let's move to Shachar Pinskel's question. The question is for you, Zackary. Can you speak about the experience of translating Sutzkever's short stories? Why translate these stories now? How different it is from translating his poem? How different it is from translating more traditional Yiddish fiction, and also how Israeli the stories are? Oh, you're on mute.
It's a lot of very good questions. I think I'd preface it by saying briefly that Sutzkever, even though Yiddish literature is not as well known as it should be, Sutzkever is probably among the most translated of authors, certainly into Hebrew, certainly into English as well. So the question is why that this wasn't said explicitly, but some people might wonder why more Sutzkever. I think the prose poems are under-translated. Some of them have been translated before, but not in their entirety. They take place in this liminal space. They are prose poems about the Holocaust, but not in the Holocaust as a historical event. They take place in this liminal space between the living and the dead. And they're also sort of a treasury or a repository of the idioms that he also uses in his lyric poetry. So they're a different animal in the Sutzkever menagerie. As to how Israeli they are, I will leave that for the literary scholars. There are, he was a poet of migration, sort of a poet of migration and of Europe, and then of a very a Zionist poet. And I would have to think about how these prose poems represent those different strains of Sutzkever ideologically.
We have another question from Drew, who asks, a challenge with reading older Hebrew poetry from figures like Bialik, Chernyakhovsky, and even Alterman, like you mentioned, is that they were writing from a completely different linguistic landscape than modern Hebrew poets. They often used forms found in the Tanakh or Talmud, which isn't really accessible to a modern Hebrew speaker, especially as someone who speaks Hebrew as a second language. How do you overcome these difficulties in reading their poetry? What advice can you give to non-native speaker trying to access these classics of Hebrew literature?
Okay, so I think that that I'm not native Hebrew speaker, it even makes it's easier for me because I really prefer the language of Alterman, Shlonsky, and Brenner, and Vogel. I prefer this language to today modern to this day modern Hebrew. If I can speak on my daily life in Brenner's language, I would do it. And sometimes I do it, by the way, and then people just, okay, what do you want from us? So probably Hebrew is going, I'm not I'm not an academic, but in my mind, I think that Hebrew probably is going towards the same position that happens in Arabic. That in Arabic, there is a literature language and the spoken language, and these two languages are different. I have good friends. She's Arabic. We studied French together, and she told me, Rita, sometimes I prefer to read English translations and not Arabic translations, because literature Arabic, it's not very easy for me as well. So what to do? Just to read more and more and more and more, and to use dictionaries online. There are really good online dictionaries, and there is a site of the Hebrew Academy of the language, which is really great, and I use it on a daily basis. And you just dive into it and you learn it. You study it and you try to understand it. But for me, Alterman and Shlonsky, the form is classical. So this is the form I really can relate to. It's easy for me to understand it. And probably here it's easier for me because I come from Pushkin, Lermontov, Chuchev, and the etc. So it's easier for me. And yeah, just read more Hebrew literature, which have this special language. For me, reading Hebrew literature without this style of the language, I don't like it. Really, I prefer, like, I don't, without names, but for me, for example, Yoshua Knaz, who recently passed away, I'm in love with his language. I'm looking for this Hebrew, for these words from Tanakh and Talmud, and I like to learn it. And it sparkles like some kind of diamonds for me. This is love, and I prefer this language. I even have one poem about it. I'm talking about it, that I don't know how to tell between everyday language and advanced language, and for me, advanced language is just better.
Just a small comment for me. Reading Brenner is it's an interesting phenomenon because he was writing in Hebrew at the time when Hebrew language was still in flux and still unclear what words would mean what. So a lot of the time I would actually see him trying to incorporate Russian words that would not stick. I'm like, oh, wow, this word he tried to put, but it didn't work. So it's really both defamiliarizing.
It's amazing. And also in Fogel, they called it Agas HaChashmal, the pier, the electric pier, because the lamp have this pier, and it is translated from Russian.
Okay, we have one more minute and 2 questions. So I'll ask one that was submitted electronically before, and maybe you can answer it quickly. What is your top priority in translating a poem? Content, meaning, or poetic form? This is a question from Dina Pyle.
I would personally say impression. If I have to give a one-word answer, impression, emotional impression.
Right.
Okay. For me, the form is part of the content. I can't divide it. Okay. When I translated some poem of Verlaine recently from French, and I was singing it to myself in French to understand the music of the poem. The music of the poem. You should keep the music.
Music. Right. So on this wonderful note, let me thank you so much for joining me for this first of series of events. I really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you to all the attendees for coming here and hearing us talk about poetry. Thank you so much.
Thank you.